Hey folks, gonna give it a couple minutes for some people to join.
Cool. Good morning.
As folks are joining, feel free to add your name to the attendees list, and I'll also start adding the agenda here. All right, we can probably get started as folks roll in. So just as a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube shortly after. And your participation in this meeting is an agreement to abide by the OpenSSF Code of Conduct. Cool. So let me just also, in case anybody joined late or anything like that, here is the notes. I'm also going to, once I find it in my millions of tabs, here we go. Here is also the what we've been working on most recently. Okay, before we get started with the agenda, is there anybody new on the call who wants to introduce themselves?
Hey, so this is my first time attending. I work with Sebastian at Anaconda. My name is Preston Moore. I do application system security, that sort of stuff, and we are trying to get some salsa related efforts going. And here we are trying to see what's up.
Cool. Cool. All right. Oh. Hey, Isaac. Gonna
Hey, how's it going?
Yeah, just posted the notes in there. Okay, so we can kind of get to it. So there was a couple of things that we worked on last. So we didn't have a meeting last week because of the long weekend. A lot of folks were out for the long weekend here in the US. So, and let me share my screen in a second here, and hopefully it does not cause any issues because I've been having some sort of weird screen sharing issues lately. Okay. Okay, it's a little slow, but it's okay. So what we've been working on for folks who haven't been around for a couple of weeks or who are new, just to kind of give the quick run through, is we sort of categorized a bunch of tools in the SLSA space. We sort of looked at where there were gaps and where we should be focusing our efforts. And one of the big areas we wanted to focus our efforts was around attestation, distribution, and discovery. So, there's a lot of things that are currently building the provenance, right? Whether it's some of the SLSA GitHub generator work or some of the other tools and plugins that are being built for things like, like Tecton and Tecton Chains can do this. And there's ones that are being built for Jenkins, and there's ones that are being built for GitLab. As Aaron had demoed last week at the SLSA community meeting. And so there's a bunch of stuff on that end, but when it comes to sort of stuff like, okay, cool, well, if I, generate this SLSA attestation for a Python package, how should that get distributed out and how should people be consuming it? That's kind of still a bit of an open question. And so we've been super focused on, at least this group has been very focused on sort of defining the requirements and then seeing if there are, since most of the folks on this call are at some level hands-on keyboard engineers or have some input into other groups, where we can go and say, okay, great, here's how SLSA should probably do it. Let's work with OCI, for example, to see how that should look like in a more official capacity. We've been having conversations with NPM we've been having conversations with NPM on stuff like, hey, how do they plan to, since they have that RFC that says that they're going to be both signing their packages as signing the output of their packages, as well as also generating SLSA attestations for NPM packages. And so how would that get distributed? And like they have an API scheme and whatever. And we want to kind of figure out as well as they are beginning to build some of that stuff out, if some of that stuff can be then standardized, right? So that, just assuming, for example, like if most folks can use a similar pattern to what they are doing for, let's say, Maven, for, whatever else, then maybe we should also use the same sort of thing. Or if there's reasons why we need to be different, like let's make sure that it's clear so that, different systems that are trying to integrate with SLSA can, or different packaging ecosystems that want to integrate with SLSA, it's not just that they all have to reinvent the wheel each time. They can kind of look at what's been going on. So that's really where we've been focused. There is one particular item we can talk about a little later, which is more around what happens when folks are not doing the Maven NPM OCI stuff, right? Like if they're not using, existing patterns, like especially like the OCI one, which is relatively codified at this point, and we're just kind of figuring out some of the details. But for cases where you're distributing files, like in the SLSA GitHub generator, where it's JSON lines files, which are the in toto, the recommended in toto practice is to use something called JSON lines and distribute it that way. Cool. So that's that. So before kind of moving on to any specific items, is there anything anybody wanted to bring up as far as any of this? Is there stuff that folks think is missing, want to be added? Once again, this is just, this is an open document. So if there's things in here, like if folks are super familiar with, for example, Python or whatever, and they know how they want this to start to work, or they have some ideas and thoughts on it, feel free to put it in here as well.
I think there's one thing that we could promote to package management system maintainers, is that in effect, once you've got a SLSA attestation for an artifact, you've also effectively got a digital signature for it. Mm-hmm. Because the attestations act as proxy signatures for the actual artifacts. So rather than having to go through the process of building your own signing mechanism for artifacts and generate SLSA attestations, you could just go as far as generating the attestations and then have the signatures by default.
Yeah, since the attestations contain, stuff like the hashes, it's yeah. Aaron?
Yeah, I was just going to underscore that. So Sean, that's such a good point. You almost don't have to spend the compute time or whatever you want to call it, or the complexity of signing the artifact, because if you do have an attestation pointing to, or the hash of the thing, the artifact, then that's as good as gold in a way as well. Because if unless the attestation's been tampered with, right, that's the one thing. But if we're up to SLSA level 2, or we're really up to SLSA level 3, it's definitely a little bit higher trust in that attestation itself, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think also, if you given that a common pattern right now is to if you are signing the artifact directly, you sign the artifact and the attestation pretty much at the same time, so you run into the same problem. Like if you're not SLSA level 2, 3 or whatever, and you are that key is potentially being used for other things anyway, you still have the same problem whether or not you're signing the attestation or signing the artifact directly. So I think it's there's I can't think of a point where somehow signing the artifact would be more secure than just signing the attestation, or doing both or whatever. But yeah, that makes sense. That referred to. Okay, cool. Yeah, so that makes sense to me. I agree with that. Anybody else have any other thoughts on that?
So I have a couple of questions, actually. The first of which is, given SIG store is in the OpenSSF family, to what extent do we have a bias towards SIG store and the SIG store toolchain as part of the solution here? Is the first part. And then the second part I was wondering was just around, we're talking about attestations. So far, the tooling that we have generates provenance. And the provenance itself doesn't make any claim about the SLSA level of an artifact. If you want to make a claim about the SLSA level of artifact, you produce the VSA. And it could be a different entity producing the VSA than actually does the build and produces the provenance. And so when we're talking about signing the attestation, are we talking about the provenance, which is the tooling we have today to generate and sign provenance, or are we talking about a separate process which generates the VSA and actually makes an attestation about SLSA levels specifically?
Yeah, so I think right now we're talking mostly about the actual provenance attestations. Whoops. Because so for folks who are not super familiar, like some of the other stuff that's being discussed is how will people be essentially making assertions that a particular build system or whatever is SLSA level 3 compliant, and then you can go back and say, great, all these attestations which use this builder at this time or whatever can go and say, yep, we believe, if we trust that auditor conformance, whatever, if we trust that claim, then we can say that these attestations are all SLSA level 3 or whatever. Sean?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points here in that. Firstly, I think even though the attestations themselves don't make any explicit mention of which SLSA level they think the artifact was built at, you can infer that because all the data you need to check against which SLSA level it was built against is in the attestation. So like whether it's reproducible, whether dependencies are complete, and all those things are actually part of the attestation. So you could potentially infer from an artifact attestation, from provenance attestation, at what level it's been built at.
Only if you trust the builder, though, right? I mean, there's an implicit trust there, and when GitHub Actions says that this was built hermetically and in an isolated environment, we believe that.
Ultimately, there's a root of trust somewhere, and you have to trust either an organization or a person to have done what they say they did. There's at some point the whole tree has to kind of have a root. So yeah, yes, you do have to trust the builder, but then okay, well then you can kind of devolve trust. You can put into your kind of tree of trust the people who generated the builder, and then perhaps you can check a VSA against that. But ultimately, somewhere along the line, you're trusting something.
Jay?
Yeah, so when we consider the attestations and the respective levels, you're not trusting the builder or trusting the organization. You're trusting the process. So this process should be clear. When you're attesting to something, you're attesting to the level at which, especially when you're considering levels, and I would use the term of maturity levels. When you're signing an attestation, you're attesting to the level at which it was built at. I mean, and I mean that there's that in that attestation, it should clearly have all of the requirements of that level per the process in place to get to that level. So you're not trusting an organization or trusting a builder, you're trusting a process, and then you're attesting. Now, the only other instance of this is when you're doing a third-party attestation, where now you're relying on the credibility of the third-party organization completing the attestation, but then there's evidence involved. So what is the evidence that suggests that you've met the requirements at each respective level per the attestation? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I think one of the big concerns with SLSA is because a lot of these things are just being claimed, right? And anybody can sort of claim anybody can sort of claim any sort of evidence in there, right? Like I can falsify a bunch of different evidence. So a lot of it's going to come down to who, the process itself is, hey, that's great. Like, but if individual elements of that process can lie, and falsify the evidence in some capacity, we need to also have some level of, do I trust the party that is making the claim in the first place, right? Are they generally trustworthy? Are they a major company with a lot to lose by lying to me? Or in things like that as well, I think is kind of really important there. And that's kind of where I think some of the stuff that Sean was talking about with like the VSA is like, hey, would somebody come in and sort of assert that like, no, I checked up on, the process itself is fine, but are all the components that this third party is using for that process, do we generally trust those things that they're doing the right stuff?
That's where the automation comes into place, and I'll go back to it. I mean, because I don't necessarily disagree, but what I'll add to that is, if it comes down to me having to trust an organization or trust an individual, I'm going to say every which way from Sunday, neither. Show me the process in place that's being used. Let's find the holes and the gaps there that can be filled in order for me to be assured about whatever process or whatever evidence that's being collected or what have you. I mean, there are things that we can put in place to make sure that falsification of evidence doesn't occur. There can be a chain of custody that occurs, right? So show me where the evidence was generated, show me where it was stored, show me who signed it being stored, give me the downline trace of all of this evidence. Give me the downline trace of this attestation so that I can be assured that there were no gaps involved and we can clean those gaps up. That's just about patience, and that's just about due diligence at that point.
Jay, I'm not sure I quite agree with that as a viable proposition. For instance, we have GitHub Actions as a CI/CD system today generating salsa provenance, and part of saying this this artifact is salsa level 2, or in fact, let's go with salsa level 3, is saying that these builds were done in an isolated way and hermetically, right? And so and unless we're saying people need to go in and audit the internal architecture of how GitHub is doing its builds, and there's no possible contamination between build processes or one build and a subsequent build or so on, like that's part of the attestation. And so what you describe is, hey, we need to go in and do a review with GitHub and look at the details of their internal architecture and make sure there's no possibility of contamination between builds. In theory, sure, we could show up with like KPMG or Accenture and go and do an audit of GitHub. I don't think GitHub's going to be open to that. And I don't think at scale it's a viable proposition. And so at some point, we have to trust when GitHub says, we've architected our workflows in the GitHub Actions build system such that these reusable workflows here operate in this way. Right? I mean, when you say, show me the evidence, what evidence would you expect GitHub to show you that you would convince you of that fact?
So, I mean, you kind of hit the nail on the head there where you talked about an audit. Sure. I mean, and I'm not talking about something that isn't difficult. I'm not talking about something that isn't hard. I'm not talking about something that isn't a bit far-reaching. What I'm talking about is something that we should probably think about, because GitHub is not infallible, nor is any organization. When it comes to their processes in place, right? So now it becomes, I mean, we're talking about a situation where now it's how assured are we that the process that GitHub uses internally is being followed?
No, that's right. I actually have a couple of slides here. I don't mean to monopolize the meeting, but if I could just throw up a visual here, I think it would actually be helpful to kind of guide this discussion, because this is something I've been working on recently. Would that be okay with you, Michael?
Sure. Yeah. Just FYI, Isaac, I don't know if anybody else is having issues, but I think your mic is getting a little garbled.
Yeah, I hear
Oh,
it too.
I'm
But I can still understand them, so it's all
Yeah,
good.
I can still understand you if for some reason there's but just so you know. and sure,
Okay.
let's give it a couple of minutes and then we can kind of move on to the next topic. But yeah, no, Isaac, we should sort of show those off.
So let's see, do you all see this?
Yep.
Yep.
So we have here, right? We've got various consumers with admissions policy for the artifacts that they rely on, and in some cases, in this diagram, we've got GitHub saying, "Hey, I built this artifact at salsa level 3. Actually, this elides the question about the VSA, because it's the VSA, not the provenance, that makes that claim." But let's say GitHub says, "Hey, my build, this provenance is conformant with salsa level 3. This build was hermetic, it was isolated, and so on." And so we've got various consumers who have various trust policies here. So consumer A is saying, sure, if it says anything that says it's salsa level 3 is fine with me. Consumer B is like, yeah, I'm only trusting attestation from builders that I control. I'm not trusting this. Consumer C has trust in GitHub. Consumer D has trust in GitHub, but only up to salsa level 2. So they're not believing that GitHub is actually producing isolated builds in this case. And so we have, yes, in this case, this is a root of trust in GitHub, and some of the consumers trust GitHub and some don't. In terms of the auditing picture, it might look more like this, where, hey, we've got GitHub again making the same statement. We've got an independent auditor. Trailer Bits is just illustrative here. Don't anchor on that. And we've got the OpenSSF, who has blessed some set of auditors to go and do audits and qualify builders at certain salsa levels. And so consumer B in this case There's again, like, is a no on this because it's still only trust its own builders. Consumer C trusts the OpenSSF and via delegation of that trust via trailer bits, and the audit system admits the artifact. And then the third slide I have here is coming back to Python. We have a trust boundary, which we can actually put up around PyPI here, where GitHub is making this statement, a claim about the artifact that it's built using GitHub Actions, using a reusable workflow, and so it's conform with SLSA level 3. It's actually PyPI in this case that is establishing the upstream trust. It's trusting GitHub Actions builds to be conform to level 3, and then PyPI itself is signing the VSA, which it then transmits downstream. And so PyPI is a very useful trust boundary here that consumers A, B, and C all trust implicitly in PyPI. They're already using pip install. They're already trusting in this as a distribution mechanism for Python packages. But none of the consumers in this case need to know about anything that's upstream of PyPI because there's this trust boundary here. And so ultimately, a couple of statements here. I think ultimately, yes, we need to have some root of trust in these schemes here. At some point, somebody needs to trust GitHub or needs to trust the OpenSSF that trusts an auditor that audits GitHub. But there is an anchor of trust in all these diagrams. Something I think that's worth exploring is, what does a trustless implementation of this look like? And so how would we use techniques like those behind transparency.dev or architectures where you don't have to have trust in individual entity. You actually have witnesses and a gossip protocol, which allows you to not have single anchors of trust in single entities or organizations. But I think that any scheme that we can imagine short of that has a root of trust in an entity, whether that be an auditor or GitHub or the OpenSSF who blesses auditors and so on. And I think that there are elements of the GitHub architecture where, just as a practical matter, someone showing up the front door of GitHub and say, hey, I'm here to audit your builder to make sure your SLSA level 3 conformant. I'm not sure that GitHub is going to let me in their front door to do that. And so as a practical matter, Jay, I hear your point about, it's not easy. My argument is it's not actually beyond not easy. It's not pragmatic at scale. And so I don't think we can pursue the idea that anyone who wants to trust a SLSA level 3 artifact coming from GitHub Actions has to go and audit the GitHub builder.
Yeah,
and so I don't mean to rat hole on this. I hope these slides were useful and I can throw them into the chat if people want to refer to them.
Oh no, these slides are fantastic. And I think my where my point was right at the, for instance, Trail of Bits, right? That is the third party organization that was assigned to audit the attestation, right? To do the audit for the attestation. They're trusted by OpenSSF. It's the process that they use, the artifacts and evidence that's obtained that they trust from the process that's being used to perform the audit. Yes, in some respect, and now you say that GitHub is not going to allow that. What I'm saying is it's hard, maybe next to impossible at this point, but at some point, if we have another instance where GitHub comes up on some type of article or some type of blog as having been breached in some way, shape, or form, maybe we should be able to audit their processes, not necessarily audit something like the build itself, but audit the processes by which those builds occur.
No, that's a very fair point. And I think in that case, actually, we have another use case to explore, which is if GitHub is breached, what do we do with all the SLSA attestations it's already given out? And how do we need to distrust or revoke those? Or what does that look like as an overall life cycle event? So I think that's worth recording and putting a pin in as something we're going to have to revisit, that, what happens when, it is revealed that our trust in entity X is actually been undermined. And that could go for the auditor too. What if we, trust in Trailer Bits to do the audit? Turns out they weren't really doing the audit. They were going down the pub and just signing off, right?
Exactly.
So at some point, we need to figure out, what does the revocation scenario look like? But Michael, sorry, I didn't mean to monopolize the conversation here. I'm happy to share the slides in Slack. I think this is probably a longer conversation, but it seems one that we need to get to the bottom of it at some point.
Yep. Sean.
Yeah, just briefly then, I think two things to note there. One, an audit is only a snapshot in time, and so it doesn't give you a guarantee that anything going forward is still valid. And two, I think the only way you can reasonably perform this audit is to follow the kind of the reproducibility requirement of SLSA 4, and actually independently reproduce the build yourself using the same mechanics.
Yes, and that's where I think we end up if we go down the transparency.dev path and look for, essentially trustless architectures here. We get to, suddenly you're looking to, hey, I want to do this build across these 6 builders here and compare the outputs on it. At that point, if they all agree, I have some trust in the artifact. Again, Mike, sorry, back over to you.
Oh, no, yeah. No, this is, I think, still useful. And I think, the one thing this kind of brought up is something to maybe bring back up to the specification and positioning groups, just to sort of really highlight that, like, hey, look, as we begin to start to think about like distributing this stuff, people are going to start asking those questions of like, okay, cool, how do I delegate trust? Who do I trust? I think Jay still brought up a very good point, which is like, as much as we can, if you can kind of say there's a limited, like, it's about how many elements of that process do you need to audit to feel confident that things are still good? The smaller that scope is, the easier those audits are, right? So it's like kind of like that problem of, and I know it's something that we've been looking with some of the tooling is, hey, if you're, it kind of goes to the non-falsifiable yada yada requirements, which are like, if you're using keys based on workload identities and stuff like that, they're a little bit, you have increased confidence compared to a long-running key that could be potentially stolen and that kind of thing. So there's definitely some elements there as we're kind of also building out the tooling to see like where can we support some of these things, like even stuff like hardware root of trust, because that also helps with some of those things further down the line. But yeah, I think, yeah, it's worth putting a pin into, and also probably worth bringing back up to the specification and positioning groups to kind of provide some of that guidance so that when they have finished that, they can come back to, we can kind of take the information and the decisions that they have made around VSA, around conformance, around audit and those things, and saying, okay, great. Now, when I pull down attestations, I probably also want to pull down, if I haven't already, some element of, hey, this person signed this thing and this other third party is asserting this, or they don't have a third party assertion, so I'm mostly taking them a little bit on faith at some level, right? There's stuff there that I think when it comes to the distribution standpoint, we'll have to kind of consider. But for now, I think we can think a little bit more about just purely stuff like the actual attestations themselves, the provenance attestations themselves. And so I'd be curious, like, have folks given, I know, Sean, you've been doing some stuff regarding the, like I know Python and that kind of thing. Do other folks have ideas around how some of this stuff is getting done with Python, or how you want it to get done with Python? In this case, distributing the attestations.
So just to make a comment, I haven't thought specifically about Python, but maybe one way we as a group can think about this type of thing is, thinking about ourselves as consumers, how would we ideally want to get this, right? Like, I think that's the best way to think about it. Because if the consumer, it's easy for the consumer, then and it's the right way to do it as well. I think that's the best way, obviously. So that's like a good way to frame it, I think, right?
I think that's a great framing. And I think for me, and the way I've been conceptualizing this is, as a consumer using pip install, it seems to me that either in my environment or as an explicit flag to pip, there should be some policy surrounding pip install, such that my organization may set the policy if I try and pip install something that isn't at a SLSA level 3, it's going to fail or give me a warning. And so, hey, I did install URL3 or whatever it may be. And it's pip in that case that is looking at the VSA. And so the diagram I showed, which had a trust boundary in it, it's actually PyPI, which is signing a VSA and providing, you know, some assertion that this particular package was built at SLSA level 3. And so when I pip install that package, it says, great, your local policy says you can only pip install SLSA level 3 or above, so that works. And for other packages, SLSA, the SLSA provenance may be completely missing. In that case, PyPI does not sign a VSA, or it just says, hey, this is SLSA level 0. And the pip install fails or gives me a warning or other. But I think looking at it, to Aaron's point, looking at it from the consumer perspective, what's the end user experience here? It seems to me that building this functionality where the SLSA attestation is discovered and verified within pip itself or within that process seems to me super low friction and super aligned with what a user would want and expect.
So one quick point. So I agree with that. There was a few folks, I think, in one of the previous meetings who had said, yeah, that's probably going to work for a lot of the common packaging ecosystems, but we probably also want to still sort of consider like some out of band potential solutions as well for folks who, and then also think about stuff like libraries and tooling to help those tools like pip, npm, maven to adopt that, because one of the things that was brought up is, you know, there's like hundreds and hundreds of technically packaging tools out there, and expecting them to all just sort of natively integrate with SLSA is going to be potentially a little difficult. But we can probably do at least something, right? We can probably do, you know, we could probably hit the biggest of the big, right? Like, you know, pip, maven, npm, you know, gems and that kind of thing. But I think the things that on that end is how do we do that from the perspective of also like keeping something like that cosign verify. What's the I'm trying to think of, give me a couple of seconds. I'll think of what I was thinking, but Sean.
Yeah, no, I was thinking we should take a look back at the comments I made in the rough notes section down at the bottom about the levels of integration for package ecosystems, because there are, you know, potentially hundreds of package managers that you could be using, and any organization might be using multiple package managers for multiple things, and they might have a policy about SLSA, but not all of their package managers are actually going to be able to deliver that for them natively. So I think there's, you know, there is scope for having like a native integration where pip actually does the SLSA verification for you. And then there's scope for hybrid systems where, say, for example, you know, if in a native system, you'd have pip and PyPI. So PyPI would be publishing VSAs and attestations, and then pip would be verifying them up against the, you know, up against PyPI. Then you could have a hybrid ecosystem where the client tooling could optionally use a third-party service to get the attestations for the artifacts that it gets via its regular mechanism. And then there's a kind of a completely standalone integration where you have the package manager just continuing to do its own thing, but then you can go to you can use another tool to go to a third-party store and get the attestation data for those.
Yep. Yeah. So totally agree with that. Let me try and turn my video back on, see if my PC's okay. Seems to be okay now. So yeah, I agree. I think one of the things that was kind of brought up before a little bit, and to kind of switch topics slightly, is one of the things that was kind of talked about with like, I know technically SLSA can use whatever, but the most common thing it uses right now is in toto attestations. And, you know, there's, as we are kind of coming together. We're trying to kind of see how we can kind of standardize around also builder specifications as well, and some of those things, so that the output of some of the details can also be standardized, so that the individual tools now can be able to do some of that. I don't want to say policy validation, but can sort of parse through an attestation I'm going to say not necessarily it itself make those decisions, but be able to either call out to other things or whatever, have those decisions get done in some good way. So that's stuff like, is this signed by the right party? Looking through the evidence, does the evidence make sense to what we have for our policy? That kind of thing. Not saying that PIP or NPM itself would do that, but maybe, if you had something like PIP, okay, cool. PIP calls out to another third party sort of policy thing that does that verification or something like that. I don't know. But I think there's some interesting stuff that's been discussed regarding like sort of JSON lines, right? Which is the standard in Intoto on how to sort of distribute Intoto attestations as files. And some of that is kind of like where people are starting to say, hey, is that a reasonable place to start? Is to assume, let's say, that when you do a pip install or whatever, that you're downloading a JSON lines file associated with it or something like that. And then, you then do that parsing, and then that kind of says, okay, great. If it doesn't have native pip and PyPI integration, you are still sort of able to kind of provide some sort of I'm going to say identification discovery mechanism, something like, hey, if I go and I do a pip install, is there something common, like some common identifiers that we can go and say, great, these are the common unique identifiers for every package, and so every version of every package, and then we can go and say, great, here, okay, I know, similar to how it's being done right now in OCI, before the newer OCI changes came in, right? I have a hash of a package. And, I'm looking for a file called, hash.attestation or hash.salsa.
Yeah, I think I like the kind of unique hash reference mechanic over potentially Perl or something like that, because we have we have situations where we might have the same Python package, or say we're talking about Nokogiri or something like that in Ruby that links an underlying C library. We could say, in terms of Perl, we've got, it's Nokogiri, it's this particular version of Nokogiri at this particular revision or whatever. For this particular architecture. But what that doesn't encapsulate is that I've linked it against a different version of libxml2. So I might have 5 artifacts that match that Perl, but are completely different in terms of their operation because they have different underlying dependencies. So yeah, we are currently using kind of individual artifact IDs, which are generated as Merkle hashes of the dependency chains for each of our artifacts. And that's how you reference kind of the active state artifacts, is via their artifact ID, which is a Merkle hash, so that we know, we've got kind of some of that provenance baked in, and each individual permutation of that has its own unique artifact ID.
So just to jump in, so I'm definitely not trying to go down a rabbit hole. Hopefully I'm avoiding that saying this. There's, you do a pip install and somehow pip has cosign integrated with it, and cosign verifies the attestation for your, Python package you just installed. But maybe the basics are, yeah, it has a valid salsa provenance format. But, what security do you really get from that? Because a malicious actor could generate a proper, so I'm not trying to go on the rabbit hole, but right, maybe there is another, and I think, Mike, you were kind of going down this route with what you were just saying, like maybe a third party or like out of band, hey, this is what you should expect to see to validate against this provenance that's coming in. I think that's definitely like something that's interesting, because like a malicious actor, you know, or even a phishing attack can occur, right? They can generate a salsa provenance and it can look good when you do a pip install and it verifies that it's been signed, right? So I think that's an interesting factor for when we're talking about distributing, and like for this type of thing, like having like what should you expect to see, not just expecting to see the format, but what should it actually be? Right.
But by that, do you mean like the actual metadata in the attestation? Sorry,
Yeah, I suppose like right. So like, you know, for like some of these even like typo squatting type attacks, you know, some of these folks are trying to make it look like, you know, oh, I just installed requests from Python, but it's actually recurse or something, and
yeah.
it's not actually coming from the request, you know, built GitHub repository. So maybe that's the third party, or like the third, where you can verify that this is actually something that you expect to see. I don't know. That's kind of my thought.
Yeah,
Not
I
sure
think that's definitely an element of graph walking you need to do to really be sure that what you've got is what you think it is. So I think there's, you know, okay, so, you know, the authors can actually either produce an attestation or a signature for the source code, and that's great. And then, you know, what SLSA will allow us to do is kind of generate that chain of custody for every process that goes between the source code and the bits.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's what we should be aiming for. And I think there's an interesting thing in there, in that yes, you should be checking the signatures at every point, and you should be walking the graph all the way back in order to work out, you know, exactly whether the provenance is accurate. But you should also be working out who's allowed to sign for what. So it's, you know, you wouldn't necessarily expect the authors to be able to sign for the build, or the builders to be able to sign for the source, and vice versa. So there's a policy element there that you need to be able to find out who's allowed to give a valid signature to what stages in the process.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that, and I think this is something that's interesting. And to be clear, like we're doing some similar stuff with Guac, which is one of the tools that we're starting to build with Google and stuff like that. But I think what I'm hearing, and like feel free to disagree, but what I'm hearing is it might make sense for us to, as a group, to maybe start a POC around just assuming file distribution generically, do some of those initial things of like, okay, cool, how do we verify the signatures? How do we do some basic verification? And then start to dive into stuff like the policy and whatever. Because like, I think a lot of those things are going to be hard until we actually have a reasonable understanding of how will people probably be downloading this, probably be getting it, like whether it's in pip directly, whether it's out of band or whatever. And then I think we can then start to look at, okay, cool, great. Now let's look at the policy elements and do something a bit more, you know, this is actually something that we've been talking about in a couple of different meetings, is sort of the difference between like what we've been calling, and I don't remember exactly how we've tiered it, but like almost like different levels of policy, right? Like the first level of policy is essentially, is it like signed, and is it correctly, like, is the schema correct? Like, is it, you know, literally, you know, valid salsa? If yes, then cool, it goes to the sort of the next level. And then it's like dive into the actual content of that attestation. And then there's probably another level, as Sean had sort of mentioned, of which is now let's crawl the graph of everything that's in that salsa attestation that, you know, as materials. Now let's go back and say, okay, great. Here's where the source code is. Cool. Let me go and validate that it has a valid signature, that signature is, you know, the actual source code, you know, or the developer signature of the source code, like the commit itself is signed or whatever.
Right.
And so on. And then, you know, here's a security scan. Is it signed by the security scanning key or certificate? I think that's kind of, and you know, feel free to tell me, but I think that might be does that seem like a reasonable stamp, like a reasonable sort of thing that we should look at from this group? Like start off with something like files and then kind of move into integrating into the other pieces and so on?
Yeah, I think it's a good path. Like I was trying to allude You know, I'm not trying to get us to jump straight to that, but it's just something to think about.
Oh no, I think it's still super valuable. I'm just I'm just trying to think of like the practical.
Yeah, I think it's a great, right? Like, just make sure we can get the thing and verify the format, right? Like, that's the minimum, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, if we are doing that, at the very least, one of the things that you can do is have it actually echo to the user that I got a valid signature for this attestation from this party, and allow them to kind of manually make that decision initially.
Cool. Yeah. So on that end, I don't know exactly what it takes. I think I'm technically an admin on the SLSA org and GitHub. I'll double check. But we might be able to just go in and you know, or somebody who has admin can go in and create maybe a repo for this sort of tool. I am ambivalent on what language we, you know, build this tool in. You know, I personally, I'm know Go, I know Python, I know Rust. Those are the three main ones I'm familiar with. But I'm down to sort of maybe, you know, start hacking around something like this with, you know, I think the two things we'll need to sort of answer are, or the precursor thing that we'll want to answer is generally how are we expecting these things to be stored? Are we just assuming for now this stuff is going to be stored as files coming from HTTP endpoints? You know, and we just kind of go in and you know, make a sort of a request like, you know, hash.salsa or whatever, or hash.att, and just kind of saying, hey, let's start from there and then see where it goes? Or do folks have other thoughts around that?
Yeah, I'd go with easy first.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I just want, like, I'm not, you know, like if somebody had said, actually, there's a, you know, somebody has written up a really cool FTP sort of thing, like, okay, let's do that. I'm, you know, ambivalent a little bit there, but yeah, if HTTP just, you know, makes the most sense, we can probably just literally, you know, say, and in fact, actually, just to give you an idea, because I've done this in some of the Nix stuff, let me pull up my repo here. So just as an FYI, this was one of the things I had done for the Kubernetes, that big graph thing I showed off a couple of months ago. But I have something like, if we wanted to, here's like 1,300 or so attestations that all sort of make that graph, that we could just start of, you know, I think we need to sign them and turn them into JSON lines files, but we can, yeah, whatever. Like there's definitely things we can probably do here. Even maybe, I wonder, we could probably call the if we needed to without even running anything, we can probably call the do something like, you know, store it in GitHub and call the raw and just say, hey, great, we pulled it down via that. We could probably do something like that for now, or you know, but we'll get to that. Just using Intodo tools as placeholders.
Well,
so
I think one of the nice things
go ahead,
about
sir.
files is that if it's just kind of, if you're being delivered a file that has a signature on it, you can validate that signature. If it's some sort of arbitrary query about the data, and it doesn't actually just give you back the file, it gives you elements of the file, how do you validate a signature against it?
Oh, yeah.
Simple files is probably the easiest thing to deal with, at least initially.
Yeah, and so in this case, I'm not saying like literally these files. It would probably be the literal JSON lines files with the signatures included. Yeah, yep. So for so Sebastian, so I'm actually not super familiar about all the Intodo tools. Is there a thing that, like, are there Intodo tools today that kind of just download from like REST endpoints or something like that?
That I'm not sure about. But you know, there are certainly Untitled tools that will process a policy and like verify things against it and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, yeah. So yeah, I figure it'll probably be either some combination of the tools or the Untitled libraries we'll just be using directly and just kind of doing some of that stuff. Cool. So the only other, I think, open question I have is any thoughts on what language this tool should be written in?
Yeah, I mean, I think if pip is one of our kind of first targets, Python probably makes sense.
Yep, that seems reasonable to me. Python's my most familiar language, so that's easy for me. I know if there were other folks, they'd probably be saying Go right now, but I'm okay with just saying, you know, let's use Python. And then also, I believe, let me just make sure, there is the SigStore Python library now, which is also one of the more, you know, readily what's the word, up to date SigStore sort of implementations. So yeah, it still says it's not for general purpose yet, but given that what we're doing is not super
well, we've already said it's a proof of concept, so
yeah, let's see, do they have well, we'll have to, we're already pretty much at time, but we'll look a little bit at some of this stuff, because it's not clear if SigStore, the Python SigStore, verifies stuff like SLSA yet. It looks like it verifies signatures, but maybe not verifies signatures on, well, I mean, you could probably verify the signature on an attestation, but not go a level deeper. I don't know. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I think the first step is just to kind of get the initial GitHub repo set up and start going. Any other questions, comments, concerns? I once I kind of get that initial thing set up inside of the repo, I will ping it in the Slack chat, the salsa-tooling Slack chat, and we can start poking around with it. Sound good? Cool. Anything else? Otherwise, we can end 2 minutes early. All right. Just as an FYI, actually, the Intoto community meeting, I believe, is in 2 minutes. So if I will probably be asking some questions from that group about some of the Python Intoto stuff. So
Thanks.
everybody have a good weekend.
Cool. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.